In the shadows of America's cities, a hidden war divided brothers, families, and an entire generation. Latino Blood, the Cold War of the gangs that divided the United States, exposes the untold story behind decades of loyalty, betrayal, and survival. If you think you know how deep this conflict runs, think again. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the dark truth that shaped Latino history across prisons and streets. Every episode reveals what others fear to tell, and only the brave will watch until the end. It began on the sunburned streets of California, in the shadows of broken factories and fading dreams. The 1960s had promised equality, but for many young Latinos, the American dream was a door that never opened. They were called Chicanos, second-generation Mexican Americans who belonged nowhere, not fully American in the eyes of the system, not fully Mexican in the eyes of the old country. They lived in overcrowded neighborhoods where unemployment, discrimination, and police harassment were a daily reality. The promise of opportunity had been replaced by the sound of sirens, and the street had become both home and battlefield. In East Los Angeles, the tension between identity and survival created a generation of young men who refused to be invisible. Many of them had fathers who worked the fields or the factories, men broken by exhaustion and silence. Their sons, however, wanted something different: power, respect, and belonging. And so began the slow birth of the street armies that would one day divide an entire nation. What started as protection from rival ethnic gangs, white, black, and other groups that targeted them, became something far more complex. The first sparks appeared inside the prison walls. In the California correctional system, Mexican-American inmates found themselves isolated and abused. Guards segregated them, rival groups attacked them, and they realized that the only way to survive was to unite. From this necessity rose a new kind of organization, structured, disciplined, and deadly. They called it La M, the letter M in Spanish, short for La Mexican Mafia. Founded in 1957 at Duell Vocational Institution in Tracy, California, it began as a brotherhood meant to protect Latino inmates. But within a few years, that brotherhood turned into an empire. The men who created La M were not ordinary criminals. They were strategists, sharp, fearless, and charismatic. They built a code, one that demanded absolute loyalty. Once you swore allegiance, there was no turning back. Betrayal was punished with death, and respect was earned only through violence and sacrifice. Tattoos of the Black Hand and the letter M became sacred symbols, marks of power that spoke louder than words. But not all Latinos in prison agreed with La M's brutal rule. In the mid-1960s, a rival force began to take shape in the northern prisons of California. These men, mostly from the agricultural valleys of the north, saw themselves as protectors of working-class Chicanos who had been mistreated by the southern gangs. They called themselves Nuestra Familia, our family. To them, La M had become corrupt, exploiting their own people for power. The creation of Nuestra Familia wasn't just rebellion, it was revolution. Soon, the prison yards became political territories, and every meal line, every exercise yard, every cell block became a war front. What began as the idea of unity among Latinos had mutated into a deep and bloody division, a civil war inside the walls of the American prison system. The Mexican Mafia represented the South, the Sureños. Nuestra Familia ruled the North, the Norteños. From these origins, an invisible border was drawn through every prison, every barrio, and eventually through the entire United States. Outside the walls, the streets were changing too. The Chicano movement was rising, calling for pride and equality. Activists like Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers fought for justice in the fields, while college students marched for civil rights. Yet, in the neighborhoods of Boyle Heights, East LA, In San Jose, another kind of revolution brewed, one made not of speeches, but of bullets. The young men of the streets admired the strength of these prison organizations. They saw in them the same desire for respect that society had denied them. Slowly, they adopted their language, their symbols, their codes. By the 1970s, the ideology of the prison gangs had spilled onto the asphalt. Young Chicanos formed their own cliques, small street crews that pledged loyalty to either the southern or northern cause. Some didn't even understand where the divide had begun. They just inherited it, like a curse passed down through generations. The barrios became recruiting grounds. The graffiti on the walls wasn't just art anymore. It was a declaration of allegiance. The letter M, or the word norte, painted in red or blue, could mark you for death. Police departments were slow to understand what was happening. To them, these were just kids fighting over turf. They didn't see the structure, the intelligence, the discipline behind the chaos. But the truth was that the Latino gangs of the 1970s were becoming organized like militaries. They had hierarchies, codes of silence, financial operations, and political influence inside and outside of prison. They weren't just reacting to oppression anymore. They were building their own empires. In the midst of this evolution, one painful irony persisted. Both sides claimed to fight for the same people. The Mexican Mafia said they represented the Southern Chicano identity, the proud urban warriors of Los Angeles and San Diego. Nuestra Familia claimed to defend the rural farm workers of Northern California who had been oppressed by both the system and their own kind. Each called the other traitors. Each believed their war was righteous. And yet both were killing the very community they vowed to protect. As the 1980s approached, the seeds planted in those early years had grown into something uncontrollable. The United States now housed two massive Latino power blocks, La M and Nuestra Familia, each extending influence from the prisons to the streets, from Los Angeles to San Jose, from El Paso to Chicago. The dream of unity that had once flickered in the hearts of the Chicano generation was drowned in the blood of its own sons. The street armies had been born, and they were preparing for a war that would never truly end. Inside the cold walls of California's prisons, the story of Latino unity had already turned into something far more sinister. What had begun as a promise of brotherhood had become a brutal test of loyalty. Behind bars, men learned quickly that survival depended on allegiance, and allegiance meant submission. The Mexican Mafia, known simply as La M, ruled with fear and precision. Their word was law, their symbols sacred. They spoke of honor, but that honor came at the price of blood. Every new inmate with Mexican roots faced the same choice: join or be destroyed. Refusal wasn't tolerated. Once marked as an enemy, your days were numbered. A single insult, a wrong glance, or a whispered rumor could seal your fate. Within the echoing corridors of San Quentin, Folsom, and Soledad, the air smelled of sweat, tobacco, and paranoia. Men whispered prayers at night, not to God, but to survive another sunrise. Those who joined La M were baptized in violence. The initiation wasn't just a ritual, it was a contract written in blood. To prove loyalty, recruits had to take a life or sacrifice something dear. Once you had killed for the organization, there was no going back. It was a transformation, a spiritual death followed by rebirth as a soldier of La M. They referred to each other as carnales, brothers bound not by family but by bloodshed. To betray that bond was to invite a punishment worse than death, humiliation, torture, erasure. But power, once born, demands more power. As La M's influence expanded across the California prison system, its leaders began exploiting the very people they had sworn to protect. They taxed Latino inmates, demanded payments from street gangs outside the walls, and turned the prisons into marketplaces for drugs, weapons, and influence. What had once been a cause for unity became a criminal empire run by fear. It was in this climate of corruption and violence that Nuestra Familia found its voice. The North was tired of being ruled by the South. In the prisons of Soledad and Folsom, small groups of northern inmates began to meet in secret. They were farmers, laborers, and street kids from towns like Salinas, Watsonville, and Fresno, men who had known poverty all their lives, now united by resentment. They saw La M as a southern tyranny, oppressing their own kind under the illusion of brotherhood. Their meetings were whispered, their codes carefully crafted, and then, one night, the first spark was lit. A confrontation in Soledad prison between a southern and northern inmate ended in blood. Within hours, alliances shifted. The men of the North declared independence. They called themselves Nuestra Familia, our family. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration of war. From that moment on, the prison yards of California became divided into two nations. Every yard had its lines. Norteños stood on one side, Sureños on the other. The cafeteria tables, the exercise areas, even the bathrooms, all became political territory. Men learned to read tattoos like maps. A red rose or the number 14 meant the North, a black hand or the number 13 meant the South. One step into the wrong section could end your life in seconds. The violence escalated. Shanks, handmade knives crafted from toothbrushes, metal scraps, or even pieces of bone, became tools of diplomacy. Murders were planned like military operations. Messages were sent through coded letters called kites, hidden in food, shoes, or even body cavities. Every act of aggression triggered retaliation, and every retaliation deepened the divide. Outside the walls, families received letters from loved ones that no longer spoke of love. They spoke of duty, loyalty, and revenge. Mothers buried sons without understanding why. Communities in East LA and San Jose saw funerals become weekly rituals. The brothers, who had once shared food and laughter in the same neighborhoods, now pointed guns at each other, guided by ideologies born in prison. The Mexican Mafia had its own constitution, a code that mixed military discipline with ancient gangster pride. Nuestra Familia responded with their own document, the Constitution of the NF, outlining rules of conduct, ranks, and penalties. Every member had a role: generals, captains, lieutenants, soldiers. Disobedience was treason. Treason meant death. In the eyes of prison authorities, this was chaos. But to the men inside, it was order. An order built on fear, but order nonetheless. They called it La Vida, the life. And once you were in it, it became your religion. Yet even among brothers, cracks began to show. Inside La M, greed and jealousy corroded loyalty. Old friends turned on each other for control of drug routes or political power. Within Nuestra Familia, paranoia ran rampant. Leaders feared betrayal from within more than they feared the enemy outside. Informants began to appear, feeding information to law enforcement in exchange for protection or revenge. One of the most infamous betrayals came when members of La M, under investigation for multiple murders, cooperated with the authorities, revealing internal structures and operations. It didn't stop the blood, it only intensified the paranoia. Every whisper of treachery demanded proof, and that proof was often found in a corpse. As the 1980s dawned, the Cold War between La M and Nuestra Familia was fully established. The prisons had become miniature nations with strict borders and codes of conduct. Each faction controlled not only its members, but also hundreds of street soldiers outside, ensuring that the war inside mirrored the war outside. The distinction between inmate and free man had vanished. The system itself had become an ecosystem of violence. Inmates entering the prison for minor crimes were quickly absorbed into one of the two sides, transforming into hardened soldiers by the time they left. And when they walked out, they carried the war with them, into Los Angeles, San Jose, Fresno, and beyond. Brotherhood had turned into empire. Oaths meant nothing if not enforced with death. The dream of unity among Latinos had died in those cold corridors. What replaced it was something far more enduring. A structure of organized power that would outlive its creators. Inside those walls, blood had been spilled in the name of loyalty. But outside, that loyalty was slowly poisoning entire generations. The line had been drawn in ink, in tattoos, and in blood. And the nation's prisons had become the incubators of America's most enduring gang war. When the gates of the California prisons opened, the war didn't stay behind. It walked out, wearing tattoos like medals and carrying rules forged in blood. The streets of Los Angeles, San Jose, and El Paso became an extension of the prison yard. The same codes, the same hatred, and the same sense of duty followed these men into freedom. Only now, there were no guards to separate them, no walls to contain the violence. What had once been whispers behind bars became gunfire in the open air. In East Los Angeles, small neighborhoods like Boyle Heights, Echo Park, and South Central turned into battle zones. Street gangs that had once fought over local pride or small-time hustles now became soldiers of something much bigger. They were called sureños, Southerners, under the shadow of La M.A., and their rivals, the norteños, took orders from Nuestra Familia in the north. The war for territory had transformed into a war for identity. Every street corner became a border. Every block was a line drawn in blood. This ideology of the prison gangs spread like wildfire. Graffiti became propaganda. Walls were marked with symbols that spoke to those who knew how to read them. The number 13 for the sureños, representing the letter M for La M. The number 14 for the norteños, representing N for Nuestra Familia. A single piece of spray paint could provoke a shooting. It wasn't just art, it was a declaration of war. The young recruits didn't always understand the full history behind their colors. For them, it was about belonging. In broken families and forgotten communities, the gangs offered what society had stolen: identity, protection, and purpose. La vida loca, the crazy life, became a way to survive the emptiness. These kids grew up hearing stories of men who commanded respect behind bars, legends who were feared even by the police. They wanted that same power. They wanted to be somebody. Soon, the streets began to mirror the prisons. Each gang had its own hierarchy: shot callers, lieutenants, soldiers, and runners. The leaders outside were often just the voice of those still locked up. Messages traveled through letters, coded phone calls, and even visitors who smuggled orders written in microscopic handwriting. The prisons controlled the streets as if they were puppet masters pulling invisible strings. Drugs became the bloodline of this new world. Methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin flooded into the neighborhoods, transforming the gangs into profit-driven machines. The Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia began taxing dealers, taking a cut from every sale in their territory. The rule was simple: pay the tax or pay with your life. For those who disobeyed, the punishment was public and brutal. It was not just business, it was terror designed to maintain order. Police forces were overwhelmed. By the 1980s, Los Angeles had become one of the most violent cities in America. Drive-by shootings became a nightly soundtrack, and news anchors spoke of gang wars as if they were distant conflicts happening in another country. But for the people living in these neighborhoods, it was daily life. Children running from gunfire, mothers lighting candles on street corners for sons who never came home, and fathers working 2 jobs only to bury their boys before their 20th birthday. In Northern California, the same pattern repeated. Cities like Salinas, Stockton, and San Jose saw their youth swallowed by the war between norteños and sureños. The agricultural fields that once symbolized hard work and family unity now became graveyards. Rival crews would meet on rural roads, exchanging gunfire under the same stars that once guided their ancestors across the desert. Each act of violence carried meaning. When a norteño was killed in the south, retaliation was expected in the north. The message would be clear: one for one. The war was self-sustaining. It didn't need leaders anymore. It fed on pride, revenge, and despair. And behind every shooting, there was a story. A cousin killed, a friend betrayed, a brother imprisoned. The 1990s brought a new wave of chaos. Crack cocaine devastated Latino and black communities alike, bringing fast money and faster death. Gangs grew richer, but they also grew more reckless. They began to recruit younger soldiers, 13-year-old kids with guns too big for their hands, barely old enough to understand the difference between loyalty and slavery. Schools became recruiting grounds. Funerals became gatherings of enemies and allies alike. Meanwhile, the authorities struggled to understand the structure. To outsiders, it looked like random street violence, but to those inside the game, it was organized warfare. La M and Nuestra Familia ran their operations like corporations, with territories, taxes, contracts, and enforcement. They communicated through coded letters from prison, known as huilas, and through street emissaries who acted as diplomats between gangs. It wasn't chaos, it was order in the language of violence. And yet, in the midst of this blood-soaked order, there were those who began to question everything. Former members who had seen too much, who had lost too many brothers. Some wanted out, but leaving was not an option. Once you swore allegiance, your life no longer belonged to you. Those who tried to escape were hunted down, often by the same friends who once called them brother. The streets were the front line, and there were no deserters in this war. Media attention only added fuel to the fire. Movies like American Me and Blood In, Blood Out romanticized the gang culture, turning prison legends into cultural icons. Young men across the country watched those films and saw heroes instead of warnings. They didn't see the funerals, the addiction, the mothers crying behind closed doors. They saw pride, they saw power, and they wanted it. By the late 1990s, the Latino gang war had spread beyond California. The lines between norteños and sureños appeared in Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and even as far east as Chicago. What had once been a regional rivalry had become a national network. The dream of freedom that awaited those released from prison had become a nightmare, a battlefield where survival depended not on justice, but on the colors you wore and the streets you called home. And so, the front line expanded. From the alleys of Los Angeles to the farmlands of Salinas, from the desert border towns to the high-rise ghettos of Chicago, Latino blood continued to spill. What had begun behind steel bars had now engulfed an entire generation. The Cold War of the gangs was no longer contained. It had turned the American landscape into a mosaic of divided streets, where loyalty was everything and peace was just a rumor whispered between gunshots. By the dawn of the 1990s, the streets of California had already turned into a battlefield, but one side was clearly gaining ground. The sureños, loyal to La M, the Mexican Mafia, were no longer just a scattered network of neighborhood gangs. They were transforming into a disciplined army, one that operated with military precision and a single terrifying purpose: to control everything. The prisons, the streets, and the very identity of Latino life in the American underworld. La M had evolved far beyond its prison cell origins. Its leadership, the so-called carnales, ruled from inside maximum security facilities, communicating with their lieutenants outside through coded letters, secret couriers, and family members who risked their lives to carry messages. Orders left the prison walls like smoke from a signal fire, invisible but unmistakable to those who understood the code. If the word came from La M, it wasn't a request, it was a command. The sureños, or Southerners, weren't a single gang, but a coalition of dozens, from the Florencia 13, 18th Street, White Fence, Harpies, Playboys, and many more. What united them was their allegiance to the letter M, the 13th letter of the alphabet, the sacred mark of La M. Through fear and respect, the Mafia had turned chaos into structure. They collected taxes from every gang operating in Southern California, taking a percentage of every drug sale, robbery, and extortion job. Those who refused to pay were eliminated. The message spread quickly: you either work for Laim or you don't work at all. The Southern Empire had begun to stretch its influence far beyond Los Angeles, from the deserts of Arizona to the suburbs of Las Vegas, and even into the prisons of Colorado and Texas. The reach of Laim grew like wildfire. Their soldiers, the Sureños, moved silently across state lines, carrying the same tattoos, the same codes, the same loyalty. Their rivals, the Norteños, found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The war for California's soul was being won from the south up. The growth of the Southern Empire wasn't just built on violence, it was built on economics. Laim understood something most gangs didn't. The streets could be conquered with money as easily as with bullets. In the mid-1990s, they forged alliances with Mexican drug cartels, particularly those operating in Baja California and Sinaloa. Cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine began flowing north through the border like rivers of gold. Laim controlled the distribution inside the United States, ensuring that every ounce that touched Los Angeles or San Diego passed through their hands. The deal was simple but devastating. The cartels supplied the product, Laim supplied the soldiers, the protection, and the streets. For the first time, a prison-born gang had become a crucial link in the international drug trade. The profits were unimaginable, and with them came more weapons, more control, and more corruption. The Southern Empire was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. But power always breeds arrogance, and arrogance invites betrayal. Within Laim, a few powerful figures began to see themselves not as servants of the organization, but as kings. They controlled not just money, but politics, ordering hits, manipulating rivalries, and influencing even law enforcement through bribery and intimidation. Entire police departments began to feel the weight of the Mafia's shadow. Some officers were paid to look the other way, others simply feared for their families. The media, hungry for sensational headlines, painted Laim as untouchable, a ghostly syndicate of Latino power that ruled the West Coast from behind bars. Every major arrest only seemed to make the legend stronger. When leaders like Joe "Pegleg" Morgan and Ramon "Mundo" Mendoza appeared in court, they became anti-heroes to the youth watching from the streets. Their myth spread faster than the truth. Young men from broken homes idolized them, dreaming not of college or careers, but of tattoos and status inside Laim's invisible hierarchy. Meanwhile, the Norteños and Nuestra Familia were fighting to maintain their hold on Northern California. Cities like San Jose, Stockton, and Modesto became the northern bastions of resistance, but their influence struggled to match the southern expansion. The Sureños had the numbers, the organization, and the money, while the Norteños were increasingly cornered, their territory shrinking, their influence fading outside the north. Still, the war continued. Every act of violence carried symbolic weight. A shooting in Fresno could spark retaliation in East LA. A stabbing in Folsom Prison could ignite weeks of bloodshed in the streets. The Southern Empire's reach was absolute, but it came with a curse. It could never rest. The same power that built it was also tearing it apart from within. Inside prison, new generations of Sureños were being recruited faster than they could be controlled. Some leaders outside grew impatient, forming independent alliances that defied Laim's direct command. The unity that had once made the Southern Empire unstoppable was beginning to fracture under its own weight. Law enforcement, by now fully aware of the scale of Laim's operation, began fighting back with unprecedented force. In the mid-1990s, the FBI launched Operation Black Widow, a multi-agency crackdown that targeted the leadership of both Laim and Nuestra Familia. Dozens of high-ranking members were indicted, and yet the violence didn't stop. It evolved. From their prison cells, the leaders continued to rule, using contraband cell phones and coded messages to issue orders. Their power didn't depend on freedom, it depended on fear. A colonel behind bars could still control hundreds of men outside, simply by whispering a name to be erased. It was empire without borders, authority without face. And as the millennium turned, the world outside the prisons had changed forever. What had begun as a fight for respect in the 1960s had become a multinational enterprise of crime. The Sureños were no longer just soldiers. They were merchants, traffickers, and ambassadors of an empire that stretched from California to Central America. The map of Latino identity in the United States had been rewritten, not by politicians or poets, but by gang generals whose empire was built on blood and silence. The rise of the Southern Empire was complete. But with power came a price, and the same shadow that had protected them for decades was now growing darker, thicker, and harder to escape. By the late 1990s, the war was no longer a matter of neighborhood beefs or whispered orders from cell blocks. It had become a chess game spread across courtrooms, wire rooms, and midnight raids, where every move revealed a darker layer of the machine. Law enforcement finally understood that what looked like chaos on the street was, in reality, strategy. Taxes collected, territories apportioned, debt enforced with fear, and a steady river of narcotics threaded through cities like veins of poisoned gold. The response came with its own kind of discipline. Task forces stitched together rival agencies that had once competed for headlines. Local detectives sat beside federal agents, analysts diagrammed networks with yarn and thumbtacks that crawled across corkboards like spider webs, and prosecutors learned a new language, the coded slang of kites, the numerology of 13 and 14, the meanings hidden in a single dot of ink on a folded page. They built cases like architects, painstakingly, one affidavit at a time. Wiretaps changed the war. Voices that had been mythical on the streets, names spoken quietly in alleys and tattooed across knuckles, were captured on tape, giving orders that sounded less like bravado and more like corporate memos. Move this weight, tax that block, greenlight the one who refused. The recordings turned legends into defendants, and the defendants turned courthouses into theaters where entire neighborhoods leaned forward to see if power could finally be handcuffed. But law enforcement victories were complicated things. Every arrest was a hit to the structure, yes, yet every hit created a vacuum. When a shot caller fell, lieutenants jockeyed for position. Young soldiers, starved for status, scrambled to prove themselves in the most irreversible ways. A decapitated hydra doesn't die, it thrashes. The streets thrashed. Prosecutors brought racketeering cases that treated gangs as crime families rather than random clusters of angry kids. Conspiracy became the word of the era. The legal net cast wide to capture not just the hand that pulled a trigger, but the mouth that ordered it, the ear that heard it, the courier who carried it, and the treasurer who counted the money afterward. In court, juries listened to the anatomy of a killing as if being taught a foreign grammar. This is how an order is born. This is how it travels. This is how it arrives. This is how it is carried out. They watched grainy surveillance footage of curbside handshakes that weren't greetings but contracts, and they learned that a nod could be as deadly as a gun. On the other side of the glass, the gangs evolved. You do not survive decades of pressure without adaptation. Phones changed, codes changed, the very rhythm of command changed. Leaders grew more spectral, less reachable. Their words smuggled through layers of intermediaries who often did not know the face of the man whose orders they obeyed. The prison yard became a parliament of ghosts. A single phrase whispered through a vent could roll through a county like thunder. That was the genius and the curse of an empire built behind bars. It could not be uprooted by a raid because its roots were not in houses or cars or corners, but in fear and the need to belong. You can seize dope and shut down a stash house. You cannot seize the story a kid believes about what makes him a man. Informants, the oldest currency in this kind of war, multiplied as the risk multiplied. Some flipped out of terror, others out of exhaustion, a few out of a faltering conscience, and not a small number out of hunger for the deal the government dangled across a table in a fluorescent-lit room. Their testimony cracked doors that had been welded shut, yet each confession added another layer of paranoia. Inside both La Aimée and Nuestra Familia, the war within grew louder than the war without. Who spoke to the cops? Who folded under pressure? Who was skimming taxes? Who mouthed loyalty but kept a separate ledger at home? Internal trials, kangaroo courts conducted in visiting rooms and exercise yards, ended in punishments that were meant to be messages. There is no safe exit. There is no statute of limitations on betrayal. There is only the final silence of those who forgot the oath. Community initiatives flickered like candlelight in a storm. Intervention workers, former soldiers of the very war they were trying to end, walked the late-night streets with the disciplined patience of men who understood that you cannot talk a kid out of a gun if you don't first talk him out of the story that put it in his hand. Some cities saw truces that held for a season, a summer where the homicide count dipped and mothers slept a little easier. But truces are bridges built over pressure. Without structural change, jobs that pay, schools that can hold a teenager's attention, housing that does not stamp a family with failure, bridges crack. One funeral becomes three. A block meeting turns into sirens. A promise made under moonlight is broken by sunrise. The war within law enforcement mirrored the streets in quieter ways. Agencies guarded turf, shared incompletely, leaked occasionally. An undercover's legend, his false life, could be upended by a careless boast at a press conference states away. Prosecutors felt the burn of cases lost on a technicality after years of work, and detectives carried the faces of dead witnesses like extra weight in their pockets. Wear a badge long enough and you learn to count victories differently. Sometimes a win is one kid who does not inherit a tattoo. Sometimes it is a young mother who can carry groceries home at dusk without glancing behind her every 6 steps. Sometimes it is simply time. 3 quiet months where the radio doesn't spit your street's name at 3 a.m. The cartels complicated everything. Money poured across the border and into the Southern Empire's veins, and where money goes, corruption follows like a loyal dog. Cases collapsed when someone with a key opened the wrong door. Evidence disappeared. A defendant who had been whispering to the government stopped whispering forever. The weight of this transnational current bent the battlefield into strange shapes. A local set might feud with another over a corner, even as both paid taxes to the same higher power. A soldier might execute a personal grudge and sell it to superiors as political necessity. A green light might be issued not for disloyalty, but for the audacity of wanting out. There were moments when the war within seemed to eclipse the public one completely. Leadership disputes ignited purges, whispered accusations became sudden demotions, measured in scars rather than titles. A man could go to sleep a respected lieutenant and wake up a target because someone higher up needed to prove he still had teeth. The old heads watched this with a kind of tired anger. They remembered when the oaths felt pure, even if purity was only the illusion of youth, and they could not stop the machine they helped build from turning on itself. Empires do not need enemies to fall. They need only hunger, pride, and time. And still, the system pushed forward. RICO filings stacked like concrete blocks. Multi-year sentences became life. Gang enhancements turned street beefs into calendar life in the blink of a gavel. Prisons filled, then overflowed, and inside them the cycle tightened its grip. Young men entered as recruits, were hardened as soldiers, and returned to the street as veterans of a war that had given them a resume with no civilian translation. In exit interviews, parole agents offered pamphlets that read like prayers: job training, GED programs, counseling. Some took the help, many didn't. When your name carries a legend in the only world that ever applauded you, a minimum wage job feels like exile. But the war within also meant this. Small acts of rebellion against the machine began to matter. A soldier quietly refused an order and moved his family 3 cities away. A mother gathered 5 boys in her kitchen and fed them after school until the habit of hunger broke. A shot caller, aging and suddenly aware of the calendar, advised restraint instead of revenge and surprised himself when the street listened. Change did not arrive like a parade. It arrived like groundwater, slow, invisible, and essential. In the end, law enforcement learned what the streets had always known. You can arrest men, but you cannot arrest a myth. You can seize guns, but you cannot seize a reason. The war within gangs and the war within the system braided together into a single truth. Structure will always try to preserve itself, even when it is killing the people it claims to protect. And yet, beneath the machinery, human beings kept making choices. Terrible ones, heroic ones, ordinary ones that never reach the news. That is where the war is won, if it can be won at all, in the quiet space where a story about power is replaced by a story about a future. The war never truly ended. It only changed its form, moving from bullets and blades to silence and absence, from prison yards and barrios to generations born into names they never chose. By the early 2000s, the Cold War of the gangs had already written its legacy into the DNA of Latino America in the United States. From Los Angeles to San Jose, from the deserts of Arizona to the industrial corridors of Chicago, the invisible border between Norteño and Sureño had become part of the landscape, painted on walls, tattooed on skin, whispered into bedtime warnings. A boy born in East LA might not know his father's real name, but he would know the numbers 13 and 14. A girl in Fresno might never hold a gun, but she would understand the color she could not wear. The codes that began behind prison bars had seeped into daily life like poison in water, colorless, tasteless, and everywhere. Teachers, social workers, priests, they all became interpreters of this new geography of fear, trying to explain to outsiders how a decades-old prison feud had turned into an identity crisis for an entire generation. What had once been ideology had calcified into instinct. Kids fought not because they believed in La M or Nuestra Familia, but because they had inherited the feud like a last name. Violence became heritage. The line between North and South wasn't just a map. It was a destiny written before birth. Some didn't even know where the conflict started or why. They just knew who their enemies were supposed to be. And yet, underneath the surface, something else began to shift. The old guard, the men who had lived through the bloodiest years of the war, started to age. Their tattoos faded, their bodies betrayed them, and their memories of the fight became ghosts of an era that no longer existed. Many found themselves asking a question that once would have been unthinkable. What was it all for? From their prison cells, some of the original generals and shot callers began writing letters of reflection, pleas for their children and grandchildren not to follow the same path. The same hands that once ordered executions now wrote words like redemption and forgiveness. It wasn't guilt alone that drove them. It was fatigue. A lifetime of power had turned into a life sentence of solitude. The brothers who once controlled empires now sat alone in cells the size of their past sins, haunted not by the faces of their enemies, but by the faces of those who had once called them father, uncle, brother. Outside the walls, communities began to rebuild. Mothers who had buried sons became activists. Former soldiers of the war became mentors, walking into schools to tell stories that didn't sound like warnings, they sounded like confessions. "We thought we were protecting our people," one ex-gang member would say, "but we were protecting the system that kept us in cages." The honesty of those voices pierced through the myths that had held neighborhoods hostage for decades. Still, healing was not a straight line. Law enforcement crackdowns continued, feeding the cycle of incarceration. The same poverty that birthed the first street armies remained, passed down like a curse. Politicians declared victories in sound bites. But in the alleys, the story was more complicated. Each generation found new ways to live with the ghosts, some through art, others through faith, and too many through silence. By the 2010s, the landscape had shifted again. Technology and globalization had changed the nature of the game. The cartels across the border now had digital reach, and gangs that once fought over street corners began fighting over encrypted channels and global trafficking routes. The Norteño-Sureño divide still existed, but it had become part of a larger, more complex web, a network that connected prisons in California to safe houses in Tijuana, from Los Angeles suburbs to Central American jungles. The Cold War had gone international. Yet even as the networks expanded, something in the hearts of the new generation began to rebel, not through violence, but through refusal. A quiet resistance grew among the children of the war. They were tired of being told what side they belonged to. They refused to inherit the old codes, the old hatred. They started to paint murals of unity on the same walls that had once been marked for division. They turned tattoos into testimonies of survival rather than allegiance. Community centers in East LA, Watsonville, and San Jose began to fill with youth who spoke a new language, one of reclamation. They used rap, poetry, and filmmaking to rewrite the story of Latino identity in America. They no longer wanted to be defined by prisons or gangs. They wanted to be defined by creation, by resilience, by the simple and radical act of living beyond the script written for them. And yet, the shadow of the divide remains. You can still feel it in the air of certain neighborhoods, in the tension that flickers at the sight of certain colors, in the caution that mothers carry in their eyes. The past has a long memory, and ghosts don't vanish easily. But even in those places, hope persists, not loud, not dramatic, but stubborn. Some of the same men who once ruled through fear now work in halfway houses, counseling kids they could have killed 20 years ago. Others die quietly, their obituaries never mentioning the wars they once commanded, but their legacy lives on in the choices their communities make every day to forgive, to remember, to rebuild. The Cold War of Latino gangs divided a people, but it also revealed something deeper, the capacity for survival. Through decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and oppression, entire generations learned to endure, to rebuild families out of ruins, to plant gardens in fields of concrete. That endurance, the refusal to disappear, is the truest legacy of all. As the camera fades on the story of Latino blood, the final image is not of prisons or tattoos or police lights. It's of a mural somewhere in East Los Angeles. It shows two hands, one painted red, one painted blue, reaching toward each other against a background of desert sun. Beneath it, a single line reads, "La guerra terminó el día que decidimos mirar al otro como hermano." The war ended the day we chose to see the other as a